So welcome to this introduction to environmental archaeology at Wessex Archaeology in South Wiltshire. My name is Ines Lopez-Doriga and I'm lead environmental officer at Wessex Archaeology. In this introduction, I'm going to speak about environmental archaeology. What is environmental archaeology? What do we do in the environmental archaeology department at Wessex Archaeology? And I'm going to present to you some case studies from the south of our county. First, I want to showcase that archaeological work is actually more than what many people think. It's not just about field work, about going and digging nice, interesting sites. There is a lot of hidden work, post-excavation work that happens behind the scenes, and it's the assessment and analysis work, and it's actually a huge part of the work. The post-excavation specialists who work behind the scenes are usually divided between artifacts specialists and ecofact specialists. So the artifact specialists are the ones that study finds on objects made of pottery, made of flint, made of bone, made of metal or glass. And the ecofact specialists, or the environmental archaeologists, are the ones that study remains associated with the environment and what people were exploiting in the past. This could be mollusks, this could be bones, seeds, charcoal, or insects, for example. Within the ecofacts, or environmental remains, we have Macrobotanical remains, which are remains of plants. And we have two main categories of archaeobotanical remains. We have macroremains and we have microremains. And well, as the name suggests, the difference is a bit in the size. So macroremains are actually small remains that need a microscope to study them, but this microscope is not very powerful. It's just 10 magnifications or even 60 magnifications. And microremains are minuscule. You cannot see them with the naked eye, and you need a very powerful microscope, often 200 magnifications, to actually see them. The microbotanical remains are, for example, pollen or spores, starch, phytoliths, and diatoms. And often they inform about how the environment was and how humans have brought changes into the environment. So, for example, pollen is a good indication of the general landscape around an archaeological site. People who study pollen also study spores often because they are found in the same types of samples. And each of these grains, pollen grains, can be identified to species level in some cases or genus level. And for example, we can know if a site had lots of pines around or other types of plant. However, we need to be careful because different types of plants produce different types of pollen. So all the information that we obtain from pollen analysis needs to be really carefully considered in terms of formation processes. Diatoms, for example, are unicellular algae, and they can inform about the presence of water in archaeological sites. For example, if we have a medieval moat around a castle and we find some diatoms in the ditch around the castle, we can try to find out how often the moat had water, if it was standing water throughout the year, or if it was only seasonally or in specific periods. Starch and phytoliths are other types of microscopic remains or macrobotanical remains that tell us about uses of plants. So, for example, starch grains are contained in underground plant parts, and they can tell us about plants that were used, for example, in pottery vessels that were cooked, and we don't any longer have them, but we have the remains that allow us to approach diet in the past. And phytoliths, similarly to starch, are also informing about uses of plants in the past. So phytoliths are silica bodies. They resist very well in the environment, and they are preserved when other types of remains are sometimes not preserved. and they are released. They are present in all plant parts, and they are released when plants are processed. So, for example, if a tool has been used to cut plants, we would have probably some phytoliths left attached to this tool, and we can know what the tool was used for. Macrobotanical remains are, on the opposite, remains that are visible with the naked eye, and we can see them when we take samples on site. However, we need a microscope to study and identify them. This can be wood and wood fragments and charcoal. It can be seeds, it can be leaves and berries, roots and tubers, capsules, thorns. All of these may be preserved in archaeological sites depending on the type of preservation on the site. Other types are, for example, stalks, stems, chaff, seed pods, cones. It's basically a very range of material. The transformed botanical remains are sort of in between, a category in between artifact and ecofact, and it's basically ecofacts that have been manufactured into artifacts, and it's a bit sometimes complicated to find out who is going to study them, and we need to have close collaboration between different specialists. So, for example, artifacts made of wood or artifacts made of fiber, like baskets. We sometimes have also imprints in pottery, like this one, where you can see the remains of a plant part that has actually disappeared, but would have been there when the pottery was fired. We also have pottery residues attached to vessels that have been used in cooking. So if we study this crust here that you can see on the lip of this vessel, you will probably find lots of remains of the food. Sometimes could be starches, could be phytoliths, pollen, that indicate what was being cooked. The same with this lamp here, which is actually a piece of bread. And although it's in very rare circumstances, you would actually identify the seeds in a piece of bread. If you do other types of analysis, you might identify some of the phytoliths or the starches or the microscopic remains. And also we have coprolites, which are actually not artifacts, but it's sort of transformed botanical remain. And through the study of coprolites, we can study diet. It's usually, from my point of view, it's the study of diet of herbivores because they contain seeds. I want to go a little bit into the preservation of macrobotanical remains. So I mentioned earlier a number of examples: seeds, charcoal, berries. All these things may be preserved in different types of archaeological sites depending on the preservation. So, for example, in a waterlogged site, we probably have the best preservation for any type of material. A waterlogged site is a site that is under the water table continuously since it was deposited. So often we get sites that are seasonally waterlogged, and unfortunately that's not enough for preserving environmental evidence by waterlogging in the long term. So in this chart here you have an example of a waterlogged deposit, this is the water table, and we have a ditch, and here we will have nice plant remains that have been permanently embedded in water. And this type of preservation allows for preserving berries, leaves, and many delicate plant parts that are not preserved by charring, for example. Charring or carbonization allows for the preservation of botanical evidence in most of the archaeological sites that we study. I think it's probably 95% of the sites that we study are preserved with plants are preserved by carbonization. And it basically represents either cooking accidents, so people were going to cook something and they had they left things too long in the fire and they got charred, or things that were not usable any longer and they were discarded into a hearth or a domestic fire, and they didn't actually fall in the middle, but they were sort of in the edges, and they get carbonized instead of just fully combusting and turning into ashes. As I said, this is the most frequent type of preservation of botanical evidence in archaeological sites. However, not all plant parts are prepared to survive in the same way to fire, so we have to take that into account. And another type of preservation that we may encounter in archaeological sites is mineralization or mineral replacement. And often this is produced in, for example, deposits like cesspits, like the one in the picture, where there is a lot of organic matter in the composition, and also lack of oxygen, possibly some degree of waterlogging. And the soft tissues of the plant remains are replaced by minerals, usually phosphate, and that allows them to be preserved in the long term without the intervention of fire. That's a very good example for studying diet. We may also have other types of mineralization, which is, for example, attached to metal. Like, for example, here you see a crust, and this is full of plant remains that have been preserved by mineral replacement. And what do we do with our environmental studies? Well, we obviously study the environment and how it was, so we can reconstruct, usually using different types of proxies or indicators. We can reconstruct how the landscape was in the past, especially around archaeological sites where we have taken the samples, and how humans have used the landscape. So this aspect is really important, and it's actually, from my point of view, as a researcher in human history, I am most interested in how humans have used the natural resources that were available for them. And this could be in a range of ways. So people have used, particularly plant resources, have used them for fuel, for fires. They have used them for basketry, for building structures, for keeping cattle in, for example, or making houses, either the walls or the roofs. Also, obviously, for medicine, drink, and food, and also for lots of different transform ways of using fuel. I've mentioned food, so yeah, Palaeodiet is one of the key issues that we address through environmental evidence. It is quite tricky, however, because we need to be very certain that what we are studying is actually the remains of food, and we cannot always be certain. So very often we can present hypotheses of very likely scenarios that something was used as a food, and that's why it's present on an archaeological site. However, we cannot be always confident. So, for example, here you can see bog body that has been preserved in peat bog in the north of the country, and this man had lots of food still preserved in his intestines, and it's in that circumstance you can prove that foods were used for plants were used for food. However, we don't have this type of preservation very often. We sometimes have teeth which preserve, for example, phytoliths attached to them in the dental calculus, so we can know that plants may have been ingested. However, sometimes people use teeth to hold materials that were being processed. So, for example, your teeth can come as a third hand when you are manufacturing something, and you might have phytoliths left there that are not actually ingested. Another way to study diet is through coprolites, which I mentioned earlier. you studying also pottery vessels that have been used in food production. However, it's difficult often to know which vessels have been used in food production, and it's basically an interpretation of the shape of a vessel and what it contains inside. If we find pieces of bread as well, we can sort of approach food production with certain confidence. And also if we find pure deposit of single species or a single type of remain, often we can suggest that this was probably something that was going to be stored for use later. But each case needs to be evaluated very carefully. So, for example, in this side of the screen, I am presenting some cases of seeds that actually arrive on sites accidentally. So, for example, seeds like this one with spines on top, they can be attached to either human clothes or to animal fur and arrive to sites accidentally. But also you have seeds that are transported by wind, like the one at the bottom, and may arrive to sites not because of human use. And also we have plants that grow in weedy habitats, so undesired locations where they, for example, contaminate a crop, and they may be accidentally gathered as part of the collection of a crop. So a plant appearing on an archaeological site doesn't necessarily mean that that plant was used, although it may have uses. I would like to tell you who we are in the environmental department in Wessex Archaeology. We are mostly doing archaeobotanical studies, so we study plants in archaeology, and we have a team of processors who prepare the samples that arrive from archaeological sites and make them suitable for our specialists to study them. So we have specialists in char plant remains and charcoal, and specialists in char plant remains, and myself, who I am also specialist in char plant remains. As you may know, Wessex Archaeology have offices in a number of places, and we do different types of archaeological projects. We have fieldwork projects, terrestrial, and we also have coastal and marine projects. And we have our environmental department is split into two offices, so samples from anywhere in the country may be processed in Sheffield or in Salisbury. So, as I said earlier, we have processing facilities that allow us to process samples to be studied for specialists. So this processing is mostly done by a process called flotation, which basically involves putting the sediment that arrives from site into water, and then that produces light matter that floats and is captured into a mess, and a heavy fraction that is captured into a different size mess. And the heavy fraction is usually sorted for artifacts, although it might contain some environmental remains, but often it's just artifacts. And the floating fraction, or the light fraction, is captured into a very fine mess, and that's given to specialists who study them under the microscope. The remains in the samples in those floats or flotation fractions are categorized according to what they are and the types of remains they are, and we identify them with the help of environmental collections, reference collections. For example, this is our part of our seed reference collection, although as you see here it contains some also other plant parts like cereal ears. And then we produce reports with the results of our studies and our interpretations that are used in producing client reports, but also general public reports and pieces for papers for other specialists to look at. I want to speak a little bit about my background as well, because that will influence a little bit the types of sites I've chosen for case studies later. So I'm specialized in prehistory and the study of first agricultural societies, the last hunter-gatherers, and their use of plants in Atlantic coast of Iberia. But I've also studied the first settlers in the Balearic Islands, and also the first agricultural societies in Argentina and in Syria. And the case studies, I would have liked to make it very specific for Coombe Bissett. However, I didn't have a lot of examples for the site, so I've widened it to the south of the county. But and why didn't I have lots of examples from Coombe Bissett? Well, it's because there are different types of archaeology or archaeologies. So sometimes we may have a question and we try to solve it finding a site that allows us to answer that question. And that's usually done in academic archaeology or research archaeology. There is also the starting point of a site. You have a site and you would like to know how it was in the past. So that leads to asking possible questions that you can use to investigate that site. And that's usually done by community archaeology groups which want to investigate the local village or the local hill fort or important space for them. However, what we normally do in commercial archaeology is investigation that is associated to development. And so somebody wants to build something somewhere that leads us to investigate that site. We do some initial investigation and we find out what sort of questions we can ask that site. And this eventually may lead to planning permission, or if we find something really important, this may allow the site to be declared scheduled monument and the development can go ahead. So around the south of the county, I didn't really find anything from the Paleolithic that had lots of environmental evidence to speak about. And the Paleolithic, for those of you who are not very familiar with names, that's basically the first humans. So during the glacial period, so until the last 10,000 years before the current time. So I have examples from the Mesolithic, the Neolithic, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Romano-British period, the Saxon period, medieval times, and also post-medieval. And I could have probably found something modern, but because I have a small bias towards prehistory, I didn't find the environmental evidence of the modern period very exciting, so I left that behind as well. So Wessex Archaeology have done some work in Coombe Bissett. However, none of that work has actually produced any significant environmental evidence. So sadly, I'm not really going to speak a lot about that. For example, there's been a geophysical survey, a radiometer survey, and a watching brief in anticipation of the construction of the butterfly bank. The removal of soil for putting the butterfly bank in place was monitored, and a single archaeological feature was uncovered, and this was agricultural lynchet. There was some flint found nearby that suggested that there was a nearby settlement, but no suitable deposits for environmental sampling were found. So going back to our map of the south of the county with the archaeological sites I've chosen for examples, we go to the Mesolithic period, and we have two sites in around Amesbury. One is actually in the World Heritage Site near Stonehenge, and the other one is in Boscombe. And they have both produced post holes dating from the Mesolithic, so that is the last hunter-gatherers before the arrival of agriculture or the adoption of agricultural and domestic way of life. And these post holes have provided environmental evidence consisting in wood charcoal fragments that have allowed to investigate the environment. We have to be careful with the study of charcoal as a paleoenvironmental indicator, because charcoal also, in addition to what was available, also represents what people chose to pick up from the environment to use as fuel. So it won't be necessarily a very straightforward interpretation. For me, the most exciting archaeology in the area is the one produced in the Salisbury Plain in the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, which are the first farmers or the first farming societies when they introduced cereals and domestic animals, and they combined the exploitation of wild resources with domestic resources. And we have lots of evidence from those periods, from the excavation of a number of sites in the Army Basin program. So, for example, we have Bulford, where we found this amazing double henge monument. This is a reconstruction on how it would have looked like in the past. However, this is how we actually found it. This is an aerial view. And for me, the most interesting in this site was not the actual double henges, which were Bronze Age, but all those little holes all around them, which were Neolithic pits, so they were there before the monument was built. And these pits have lots of different materials in them. They have animal deposits and flint deposits, and for example, very important artifacts that Phil Harding was very happy to be able to study. But for me, the most interesting remain found in there were hazelnuts. So we found, it wasn't in all the pits, but in some of them we found full hazelnuts, the whole kernels, and that was really exciting because we often find hazelnuts in archaeological sites, but it's usually the cells. So people in the past usually ate hazelnuts and they chucked the cells into fires after eating them. However, in this case, because we found the kernels and it was so many of them, we are probably in a case of a store that was going to be eaten, or maybe a cooking accident. This is a model of how cooking hazelnuts on an underground pit would have worked. So people would have put a layer of sand that is very good transmitter of heat, and hazelnuts would have been put in the pit, and again this would have been covered by sand, and a fire would have been made on top. And this would have been a very efficient way of cooking or roasting a massive amount of hazelnuts, and that may have been why we find some of the charred kernels, because maybe the fire was left for too long, or there was an accident in some way. Another site from the Army Basin program that was quite exciting was Lark Hill, and this site produced a Neolithic coast-weight enclosure. So that's another type of monument that is fairly rare in the country. So for me, the most important piece of evidence from this site is this beaker pot, where we found imprint of a plant remain. In this case, it's a barley grain. So it was quite exciting to find that, is because the samples from the deposits didn't produce a lot of actual macroremains. Going a bit further in time, traveling to the Iron Age, so that's between 750 years in this current era. and the Romano-British period until 400 in the current era, we have the site of High Post, which is also a bit south of Amesbury. This site produced a massive enclosure with lots of activity of the Iron Age and Romano-British period, and very significant animal deposits of lots of animals, a different variety of animals, and many of those were in articulated bone groups. So it wasn't reworked. The animals have been deposited there in a very relatively quick manner. And yeah, lots of different types of animals. So this is a really important deposit for the study of husbandry. However, for me as an archaeobotanist, again, the most important thing from the site is not so aesthetically appealing, perhaps. It's the evidence from the Romano-British period, and we had this corn dryer, T-shaped corn dryer, where lots of charred plant remains were found. So the idea of these types of features is that crops would be put in a sort of raised platform, and fire would be produced at the end of the flue in a pit in the ground, and this would allow to dry the crop before being stored. Sometimes they may have been used for malting. We don't really know, and we need to study each case, quantify the different types of evidence within them. But for example, it's very frequent to find germinated grains in these types of deposits. This is an example of the reconstruction of a slightly later type of crop dryer, but it's exactly the same type of functioning. So a fire would be made here, and all the heat would travel from here to there, where the crop would be here, and inevitably some of the remains would be carbonized and fall here, and this produces our samples. Traveling a bit further in time, we travel to the Saxon period. So this is 400 to 1066. And we have some interesting evidence in Wilton, where there was a sunken featured building, which is basically a building that is half in the ground, and produce some interesting environmental evidence. For example, grain of cereals, but also some wild resources like, for example, blackberry or raspberry, and also elderberry. We also found lots of remains of charred seeds, like stinking mayweed in this case, which, again, this wouldn't have been used on purpose on an archaeological site, but it would have arrived probably accidentally with the crop, and people would have cleaned the crop and discarded the mayweed into the fire together with other undesired seeds of plants, and that's why we find them in archaeological sites. This is an example of a cannabis seed that was also found in this site. We possibly, this is not a real example of the seed from the site. I don't have a picture of the actual seed, but this is how a cannabis seed looks like. And this was possibly, this plant, hemp, was probably used as a fiber plant, and that's why we found it in the site. And interestingly, we didn't have any evidence of typically urban deposits in Wilton, although it was a semi-urban location in Saxon times. But for the study of urban materials, we can travel to Salisbury a bit later in time, so medieval times, post-conquest, and post-medieval times. And we are in the process of doing a project called the Cesspit project, and it studies the environmental evidence from a number of sites that have been excavated over the years by Wessex Archaeology in Salisbury. Some of these sites were studied many years ago, but we are looking at archive material that we have in our deposits or are deposited with the museum. And we are looking at it again with the idea of studying diet from a perspective of social differences, and see when certain plants were introduced, if exotic plants were used in certain periods or in certain areas of the town. This is I'm really excited with this project, and because we often work on a single site, and this is allowing us to study the evidence from different sites, and also because I am working on this with a number of volunteers who are doing lots of work. So this is not associated to any new development, because it's studying all material that had been excavated many years ago. We don't have specific source of funding other than our internal community engagement projects. This is an example of how one of these cesspits from Salisbury would have looked like. And we have done some models to be able to explain to people how these types of features worked in the past. So in addition to seeds and other environmental remains that were used by people and ingested and actually deposited in the cesspit, we also find other artifacts that are really exciting. So for example, a bit of cloth maybe used as toilet paper. And these are examples of how our seeds from cesspits look like. And we have this beautiful book produced in 2020 on identification of material from mineralized deposits, like cesspits, for example. And so far we have produced a huge list of types of remains that come from the Salisbury cesspits. So hopefully we will have some exciting news to produce in the near future about our results of this project. So finally, I would like to thank you for your attention, and to my colleagues for all the hard work, to our volunteers who have collaborated with us in this cesspit project in Salisbury, and to the Wildlife Trust for inviting us to give this talk.